So the budget segment has been stupid competitive in the last year, and luckily for us, this has dripped down or dripped up to the higher price points. But regardless, here are the top IEMs under $500, ranking list in the comments below. Starting at the number 5 spot, we have the Blessing 3 and the Blessing 2 Dusk. Now, I know many of you guys might have thought these would have been higher up on the list, but truth is, I just don't vibe with them. In terms of technicality and resolution, they're very good, but why the 6K peak? Very unfortunate, because with the 6K peak on top of the Harmon ear gain that Moondrop goes for, genres like pop, K-pop, J-rock, J-pop gets way too fatiguing, especially at higher volumes. Blessing 3 with its extra treble and less bass doesn't help balance this out either, so in that regards, I actually like the Blessing 2 Dusk more because it has less treble, more bass to kind of smoothen out that vocal fatigue in the 6K region. But of course, at the cost of less resolution or not as sharp as the Blessing 3. Regardless, both can be a little bit thin and lean in the note weight, which is not as natural as the others above it. For example, at the number 4 spot, we have the Manger T2. Now the T2 isn't going to be as resolving and sharp as the Blessing 3 or the B2 Dusk, but it's much smoother in the vocals, much more natural, weighted, and not as fatiguing. The staging and imaging plays better to my ears, it's sharper, and the attack is much heavier and more precise, along with the staging being more holographic or quote-unquote more 3D-like, along with better bass texture as well. However, a drawback to this tuning is that the T2 can sound darker. Not dark, but it's not as exciting and sharp as the Blessing 3, which helps it scale better, but could be a turn off to treble heads. So if you love being bombarded with details, then maybe the next IEM on the list is the better pick for you. In third place, we have the Afu Performer 8. Vocal-wise, the Performer 8 is very similar to the T2, forward-leaning, smooth, but much airier and not as sharp as the Blessing 3. It does take a hit in imaging and overall resolution compared to the Blessing 3, but still very capable. Stage-wise, it's not as holographic as the T, but it's airier and more open, and in my opinion, if we're talking about overall technicality, it's a slight bump and just a better all-rounder. And as for the two honorable mentions, we have the Performer 5 and the Yanyin Canon 2. Starting with the Performer 5, it's basically a warmer and bassier version of the Performer 8 with less air and worse separation. Still a solid choice at its price point, but in my opinion, I would just save up and grab the Performer 8 because it's just an overall upgrade across the board. The Performer 5 is also very similar to the Hexa when I AB'd them, and the Hexa costs 2 times less, so that doesn't help either. As for the Canon 2, I only heard the original, but I really enjoyed the bass. It was very engaging, very fun, very punchy. If the second version improved upon the first version, and from what I've heard, the resolution got better, then the Canon 2 is looking like a very good choice because it's very versatile with the switches. However, if you wanted a bass set, then I would just get the Quartet, since it's just a much better value, or this next IEM on the list. At the number 2 spot, we have the Short Bus Glamdring, which is basically a modded S12 Pro from Michael Bruce. Simply put, it's amazing. The stage is just... Now, it's very hard to generalize the Glamdring since Michael customizes your Glamdring to your specific library and tuning preference, so basically a custom modded IEM for $235. The stage on this thing is huge, easily the best under $500, and competes with the endgame monsters like the Mest and the Z1R in terms of just overall expansiveness and stage size. The details are insane, the bass is very DD-like, and the treble has that sizzle characteristic to it that many treble heads are looking for. Comparing it to the Performer 8, the vocals are less forward, a bit lighter, not thin like the Blessing 3 or fatiguing, but it still has that airy characteristic to it, the bigger stage on top. Mine didn't have a buttload of bass, but I'm sure Michael can do that for you if you wanted so. Bass heads, go wild. As for technical performance, it's a planar, so it's very good. It's on the similar level as the Performer 8, which is very solid for its price of $235. Okay, finally, at the number 1 spot, we have a tie actually between the Studio 4 and my personal favorite, the original Manger T. But first, here's a quick rundown of the Studio 4s because I haven't reviewed them yet. Starting with the timbre, it's just... It's one of the best, if not the best, quote-unquote correct sounding sets out there. Just like its older brother, the RS5, it's incredibly natural. You can't tell this is an all-BA set at all. I still prefer the RS5 more for vocals since it's just more unique, it's more powerful, the notes extends and resonates harder, but The Studio 4 is pretty much perfect. The vocals sit at the perfect distance. It's not thin, it's not recessed, it's not fatiguing, it's not too warm, and overall it just sounds very open and very natural. I'll be comparing it to the top when it comes in, but I do prefer way more than the variations. There's no thinness to the vocals and the notes, and overall the mid-range doesn't have that scoopity scoop thing going on. It's much more natural and more enjoyable. Now the variations are still going to have better textured and rumblier sub bass along with just airy treble and better extension, but I will take the Studio 4 any day of the week because the mid-range is just so much better. The vocals are much more natural and smooth and weighted and not as thin sounding. Vocals aside, the Studio 4 is actually an overall upgrade over the RS5, surprisingly enough. Because it has less bass, more neutral and not as warm, instruments in the mid-range and low end is more pushed back and less forward, allowing a more open and expansive staging, which allows better instrument layering and separation. On top of all this, the treble is pretty much the same, so there's no hit in terms of just overall resolution either. Comparing it to the Blessing 3 is basically just a better version of it. It's what the Blessing 3 should have been to begin with, in my opinion. Vocals are much smoother, fuller sounding, not thin, and there's no peaky 6K or 5K region. The treble is still very well extended and resolution's just as sharp and clear as the Blessing 3. And the bass in the Studio 4 does not sound like BA bass. I don't know what softwares are feeding their BAs because it sounds like a DD, but keep it up. Which is why the Studio 4 gets an A from me in terms of just pure vocal performance and possibly cracking the top 5 and tying with the original Oracles, but I will need to A/B them again to double check. Even though the Studio 4 doesn't specialize in any area specifically, it does play back everything you throw at it very naturally, and in my opinion, is the best all-rounder under $500 that you could buy. But if you do want a set that specializes in something, for example vocals, then my recommendation and pick would be the original Manker T. In my opinion, it's the best vocals before the RS5 at higher volumes. My number 2 vocals for a reason. You guys should give it a try if you can still get it. And lastly, if you're not trying to spend $450 or even $250 and want to escape the IEM matrix, then just get red pilled because it's basically a less refined budget Studio 4. That aside, I hope this video helped, and with all that said,